It is not that I am brave enough to be alone. It is that I am honest enough to know the difference between company and connection. Epictetus. Discourses, Book 3.
The night you scrolled through 100 names and called no one. You picked up your phone last night, or the night before, or sometime in the last week when the quiet became too specific to ignore. You opened your contacts, and you started scrolling, not looking for anyone in particular, just looking, just feeling the weight of all those names sitting there, arranged alphabetically, perfectly still, completely unreachable in the way that matters. You scrolled past the colleagues, past the people from the job you left 3 years ago, past the acquaintances from the party you went to because you thought you should, past the family members who love you in the way that family loves, which is to say, fully, and from a distance that has nothing to do with geography. And somewhere in the middle of all those names, in the middle of all that apparent abundance, something happened that you did not expect. You stopped, not because you found someone, because you realized you were not going to. Not tonight. Not because there was no one there, but because none of them felt right, and you did not know what to do with that feeling, so you put the phone face down and sat in the dark for a moment longer than you planned. That moment is what this video is about, not the loneliness, not the explanation, not the prescription for how to make more friends or be more open or put yourself out there. This video is about something far more specific and far more honest than any of that. It is about what that moment, that quiet, private, utterly unspectacular moment of scrolling and stopping actually reveals about you. Because here is what I know after examining the most honest philosophy ever written by the most powerful man who ever lived alone in a tent, while governing an empire. That moment does not reveal a deficiency. It reveals a standard, and that you look identical from the outside, but they could not be more different on the inside. Marcus Aurelius sat in that same silence. Epictetus knew it. Seneca wrote letters into it. And what they left behind is not a manual for making friends. It is something far rarer. It is the precise and unsparing examination of what friendship actually is and what it costs to refuse to settle for anything less. You are about to find out exactly what they meant. And by the time this conversation is over, that moment of scrolling and stopping will never feel the same way again. Topic on the invisible rule that decided your worth before you were old enough to question it. There is a rule operating in your life right now that you did not choose, did not decide, and were never explicitly taught. It arrived the way the most dangerous rules always arrive, not through instruction, but through atmosphere. Through the accumulation of the thousand small moments that each seemed innocent and together became a verdict. The rule goes like this. The more people who want to be near you, the more valuable you are. The more invitations you receive, the more desirable your presence. The fuller your social calendar, the fuller your life. And the person who sits alone on a Friday night, who does not have a group to call, who cannot produce a list of close friends when asked, that person has somehow failed at one of the most basic requirements of being human. You absorbed this before you were old enough to examine it. It came from the school cafeteria, where sitting alone was the most public form of failure a child could experience. It came from every birthday party where the number of guests was treated as a measure of love. It came from every social media platform ever designed, where connection was quantified, displayed, and compared in real time, turning the ancient and private experience of human belonging into a metric that anyone could see and everyone could judge. Nobody voted on this rule. Nobody presented evidence for it. Nobody stood up in any room you were ever in and said, here is how we will see the rule among users' value, and here is the measuring stick we will use. It simply became the standard. Invisible, unanimous, and almost completely unexamined. The Stoics called this kind of unexamined assumption a fantasia, a false impression that the mind accepts without interrogation, and then builds an entire life around as though it were fact. An Epictetus, you had every reason to understand what it means to have your worth decided by forces entirely outside your control, was precise about what happens when a person allows a fantasia to govern their self-perception. He said it does not matter how many people accept a false impression. It does not become true because it is popular. It becomes more dangerous because it is. What you have been measuring yourself against is not the truth about human connection. It is a cultural fantasy about human connection. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a standard worth keeping and a prison worth escaping. The one that every thinker from Marcus Aurelius to Epictetus to Seneca circled around without ever landing on directly is not how do you get more friends. It is far more important than that. It is this. What if the number of people in your life has never been the honest measure of anything? What if the honest measure has been hiding somewhere else entirely, waiting for you to stop counting long enough to find it? Topic 2. What Epictetus learned about human company while owned by another human being. Epictetus was not born a philosopher. He was born a slave, not a metaphorical slave, not a person constrained by circumstance or limited by poverty or trapped by a difficult family situation. An actual slave owned his property with no legal right to his own body, his own team, his own name, or his own company. The people around him were not chosen. They were assigned. His social world was not curated. It was imposed. And he had no exit. Most people, when they imagined the conditions for developing a philosophy about human freedom and the value of inner life, imagine a study, a library, a garden with enough quiet to think. Epictetus developed his in his slave quarters in Rome, surrounded by people he did not choose and could not leave. Honor mastered by at least one historical account broke his leg deliberately to demonstrate that Epictetus felt no pain. He did not cry out. He simply noted that the leg would break if the master continued, and when it did, he observed that it had broken exactly as predicted. What this man learned about human company isn't like anything produced by a philosopher who had the luxury of choosing his surroundings. Because Epictetus could not afford the comfortable lead that the people around you are simply the people around you. He understood, with a particular clarity that only genuine constraint produces, that company is not neutral, that the people in your immediate orbit do not simply exist alongside you, they press, they shape. They enter the room of your mind through every conversation, every assumption, every unspoken expectation. When they begin, slowly and without announcement, to redecorate. He wrote in the discourses that it is impossible to spend time with people without being affected by them, not influenced. Affected. The word matters. Influence implies a conscious process, a deliberate exchange. Affect implies something more cellular. Something that happens below the level of intention and above the level of awareness. You do not seek to be shaped by your company. You simply are. And here's what makes this observation devastating in the context of this video. Epictetus did not have the option of protecting himself from his company by choosing better company. He had to develop something else, something interior, a capacity for discernment so refined that he could be physically surrounded by people whose values, habits, and assumptions were completely foreign to his own and remain, in every way that mattered, himself. The capacity is what he called the inner life, the place that cannot be owned, cannot be invaded, cannot be redecorated by anyone who was not explicitly invited. And the reason he could develop it with such precision is that he had no alternative. He could not leave the room, so he built a room inside the room, and in the interior room, he was not a slave. He was not surrounded. He was, in every sense that philosophy recognizes, free. What Epictetus teaches about company is not that you should avoid people. It is that you should understand, with complete honesty, what happens to you in the presence of different kinds of people. Some people make you more yourself. Some people make you less. And the rarest wisdom, the one that a man who could not choose his company had to learn in order to survive, is the ability to tell the difference before the redecorating is already begun. Topic 3. The three people Marcus Aurelius actually trusted and what they had in common. Marcus Aurelius governed 60 million people. He had access to every mind in the Roman Empire worth knowing. Philosophers, generals, physicians, poets, jurists, and scientists, all of them available, all of them eager to be near the most powerful men in the world. And from all of that abundance, from all of that extraordinary human inventory, he chose 3. Not 300, not 30. 3. The Meditations do not read like the private journal of a man who was surrounded by people he trusted. They read like the private journal of a man who understood, with painful precision, the difference between people who were near him and people who actually knew him. And scattered across those pages, in fragments that were never meant to form a list. Three figures emerge with a consistency and equality of reference that sets them entirely apart from the rest. The first was his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. Marcus Aurelius devotes the opening of the Meditations to an inventory of what he learned from each person who shaped him. The passage about Antoninus is the longest and the most specific. He does not describe a warm man. He does not describe an affectionate man. He describes a man who was exactly the same in private as he was in public, a man whose consistency was so complete that there was no gap between his performance and his reality. Marcus Aurelius trusted him because there was nothing hidden. What you saw was what existed. Until a man who spent every waking hour surrounded by performance, the consistency was not a small thing. It was everything. The second was his teacher, Junius Rusticus. From Rusticus, Marcus Aurelius writes that he learned to avoid the trap of rhetoric, the art of saying things beautifully in place of saying things truly. Rusticus taught him that the point of a conversation was not to win it, not to appear wise in it, not to emerge from it with your reputation intact. The point was to get closer to what was actually true, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth was or how unflattering it made you look. A person who teaches you to value truth over appearance is extraordinarily rare. Marcus Aurelius knew it. He named Rusticus first among his intellectual debts. The third was his co-emperor and adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, and this one is the most complicated and therefore the most revealing. Lucius was not a philosopher. He was not disciplined in the way Marcus was. He was fond of pleasure, of spectacle, of the things that Marcus Aurelius spent his private hours arguing himself away from, and yet Marcus trusted him. Because Lucius never pretended to be something he was not. His transparency about his own nature, his refusal to perform a version of himself that would have been more acceptable to a philosopher-emperor was, paradoxically, the thing that made him trustworthy. You always knew exactly where you stood with Lucius, and knowing exactly where you stand with a personage Marcus Aurelius understood, a form of honesty that most people who appear virtuous never actually offer. Free people. Across decades of public life, across the most demanding leadership role in the ancient world, across every possible opportunity for connection, free people actually made it past the outer boundary of Marcus Aurelius and into the interior realm that Epictetus also described. And what those three had in common is the thing this video has been building toward since the first moment. None of them made Marcus Aurelius more comfortable. All three of them, in their different ways, made him more honest. Antoninus by modeling consistency, Rusticus by demanding truth over eloquence, Lucius by refusing to perform. The common thread is not warmth, not loyalty, not longevity. It is this. Every one of them required Marcus Aurelius to be more of himself, not less. Every single one. That is the standard. Not how many people you have, but whether any of them, even one, has ever made you more of yourself rather than a more socially acceptable version of yourself. If you can name one such person, you are richer than most people with 100 friends will ever understand. And if you cannot name one yet, what you are looking for now has a shape. It looks like consistency. It sounds like honesty. And it never, under any circumstances, asks you to perform. Topic 4: The difference between being alone and being lonely and why most people never learn it. There are two experiences that use the same furniture but are completely different rooms. The first is being alone. The second is being lonely. Most people treat them as synonyms because they so frequently arrive together, but they are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And the failure to distinguish between them is responsible for more unnecessary suffering, more compromised standards, and more friendships that should never have been formed than almost any other confusion in human social life. Being alone is a physical condition. It describes the absence of other bodies in your immediate space. It is morally neutral, emotionally variable, and entirely dependent on the interior state of the person experiencing it for its quality. The same empty room that feels like punishment to one person feels like oxygen to another. The same Saturday afternoon with new plans that produces anxiety in someone who has not learned to inhabit their own company produces something close to joy in someone who has. The condition is identical. The experience is not. Being lonely is something else entirely. It is not a physical condition. It is a relational condition. It is the experience of feeling unseen, unknown, unwitnessed, and it is absolutely no requirement for physical solitude in order to occur. You can be lonely in a marriage. You can be lonely at a party where everyone knows your name. You can be lonely in a conversation that has been happening for years and has never once arrived at anything true. Loneliness does not require an empty room. It requires an empty connection. And empty connections are available in unlimited quantity in every social environment that has ever existed. Marcus Aurelius was almost never physically alone. The Emperor of Rome did not have the luxury of solitude in the conventional sense. There was always someone in the next room, always a decision waiting, always a person whose needs or ambitions or crises were pressing against his attention. And yet the meditations written in the margins of military campaigns and administrative crises read like the work of a man who had mastered the art of being profoundly, usefully, generatively alone inside his own mind regardless of what was happening in the room around him. He was never lonely in the way that loneliness destroys people, because he had built the interior room that Epictetus described, a place that other people as presence could not invade and other people as absence could not diminish. He was, in the precise sense of the word, self-sufficient, not cold, not indifferent, not disconnected from the people around him, self-sufficient, capable of full presence in his own company, which paradoxically made him capable of fuller presence in the company of others. Seneca addressed this distinction directly in a letter to his friend Lucilius that is among the most honest things ever written about solitude. He said that the person who cannot bear to be alone has not yet met themselves. Not in the cruel sense of that observation, but in the precise and factual sense. If your own company is something you flee of silence and unstructured team produce in you a restlessness that can only be quieted by the presence of other people, then you are, in an important sense, a stranger to yourself. And a stranger to yourself will always be easier to distract than to know. The question this distinction opens is one that most people never ask, because it requires an honesty that is genuinely uncomfortable. When you reach for your phone late at night, when you see company that you do not particularly need, when you fill the quiet with noise that does not nourish you, are you seeking connection? Or are you fleeing yourself? Because those two motivations produce identical behavior from the outside and completely different lives from the inside. The person seeking genuine connection can wait for it, can hold out for the real thing, can tolerate the discomfort of its absence because the absence is just an absence, it is not the verdict on their worth. The person fleeing themselves cannot wait. Every moment of silence is evidence of something they cannot keep named but cannot keep stop fearing. The Stoics were not interested in whether you had many friends or few. They were interested in what drove the seeking. And they had, as always, the most inconvenient possible answer. The capacity for genuine friendship begins not with finding the right people but with becoming comfortable enough in your own company that you stop needing people to rescue you from yourself. That comfort, that capacity for inhabited solitude is what separates being alone from being lonely. And it is, the Stoics will create, the foundation on which every real friendship is built. Topic 5. The personality structure that makes deep friendship genuinely difficult and genuinely rare. There is a kind of person for whom friendship is not difficult because they are broken. It is difficult because they are precise. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and it is not meant as flattery. Precision in what you require from human connection is not automatically a virtue. It can be a defense. It can be a form of perfectionism that protects you from the risk of being genuinely known by setting standards so high that no one can ever meet them. Both of those things are true, and we will get to the second one, but first, the first one, because there is a personality structure recognizable, specific, and more common than the culture gives it credit for whom deep friendship is genuinely, structurally difficult, not as a personal failing, as an architectural fact. These are people whose interior life is large, not in the sense of being rich with emotion, though that is often part of it, but in the sense of being complex, layered, and constantly active. People for whom the surface of a conversation is rarely where anything interesting is happening. People who find small talk not merely tedious but actually exhausting, not because they are antisocial but because they are hypersocial in a specific direction. capable of extraordinary depth but almost constitutionally incapable of the kind of pleasant, persuasive social exchange that most human relationships are built on and sustained by. Marcus Aurelius describes this interior experience with a precision that suggests intimate familiarity. In the Meditations, he returns again and again to the exhaustion of public life, not the labor of it, not the difficulty of the decisions, but the specific depletion of spending hour after hour in conversation that never descended below the surface. He was surrounded by brilliant people. He found most of his days in the company of those brilliant people, quietly depleting in a way that the long solitary walks he describes clearly were not. That is the signature experience of this personality structure, not misanthropy, not shyness, not social anxiety in the clinical sense, a specific kind of mismatch between what you are capable of offering in human connection and what the ordinary social environment tends to ask for. You have a great deal available at depth. The ordinary social world is almost exclusively interested in the surface, and navigating that mismatch day after day, year after year, is genuinely tiring in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who does not experience it. Epictetus understood something about this that he never stated directly but that was under the surface of almost everything he wrote about human company. He understood that the person whose inner life is highly developed is also the person most likely to be disappointed by ordinary human interaction. Not because ordinary human interaction is bad, but because the contrast between what is available inside and what is available in most conversations creates a gap that becomes harder to ignore the more developed the interior life becomes. This is not a hierarchy. The person with a rich and complex interior life is not better than the person who moves easily and happily through social surfaces. They are differently constructed, and the mistake, the one that causes the most unnecessary suffering in people of this particular structure, is measuring themselves against a social standard that was not built for them and concluding that their difficulty with ordinary friendship is evidence of a flaw rather than evidence of a fact. The fact is this: if your interior life is large and complex and constantly active, you need a specific kind of person to connect with at the level where you actually live. Not a better person. Not a more philosophical person. A compatible person. Someone whose own interior is developed enough to meet you at depth rather than on the surface. And those people are, by definition, rare, because the very development that makes them compatible with you is the same development that makes them rare in the general population. Seneca wrote to Lucilius that it is better to have no companions at all than to have companions who gradually drive you away from yourself. He was not advocating for isolation, he was stating a mathematical reality. If the alternative to solitude is company that costs you more than it gives you, solitude is not the lesser option. It is the more honest one. The personality structure that makes deep friendship difficult does not need to be fixed, it needs to be understood. And the first step in understanding it is recognizing that rarity of connection is not the same as failure of connection. Sometimes it is simply the accurate reflection of how genuinely rare it is to find another person whose interior is large enough to meet yours. Topic 6: what your standards for friendship actually say about your relationship with yourself. You have standards for friendship. Everyone does. But yours are specific enough that you are aware of them. Specific enough that they have cost you something: relationships that did not meet them, invitations you declined, connections you let fade because they never quite arrived at the level where you actually needed them to be. And at some point, probably more than once, you have wondered whether those standards are a sign of integrity or a sign of fear. That question is the most honest question this video will ask, and it deserves a genuinely honest answer. Standards for friendship exist on a spectrum that has two very different ends. At one end, there is the standard that comes from self-knowledge. From having understood, through experience and reflection, what genuine connection actually feels like for you, what it requires, what it produces, what its absence costs. This kind of standard is earned. It is the result of having been in connections that did not serve you and having learned, sometimes painfully, what you actually need versus what you have been settling for. A standard born from self-knowledge is a form of self-respect. It is not arrogance. It is accuracy. At the other end of that spectrum, there is the standard that comes from fear. from having been hurt in proximity to other people and having concluded, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that the safest response to the hurt is to make the criteria for closeness so demanding that almost no one can meet them. This kind of standard is not self-respect, it is armor. And armor is useful in war and devastating in peacetime, because it cannot tell the difference between a threat and an invitation. Most people who have genuinely high standards for friendship are operating somewhere between those two ends. Some of what they require is real, some of what they require is protective, and the difficulty, the one that Seneca addressed in his letters with the kind of directness that makes uncomfortable writing, is that from the inside, real requirements and protective requirements feel almost identical. They both feel like integrity. They both feel like you are simply refusing to compromise on something important. The difference only becomes visible when you examine what you are actually afraid of. Seneca wrote that the person who is not yet a friend to themselves cannot truly be a friend to anyone else. This statement is almost always quoted as though it is primarily about what you offer to others. But that is the secondary meaning. The primary meaning is more personal and more confronting. The person who is not yet a friend to themselves, who does not yet know themselves with honesty, who has not yet accepted themselves with the same generosity they might extend to someone they love, will lose their standards for friendship as a mirror for their unresolved relationship with their own interior. What does that look like in practice? It looks like this. You require honesty from others but are not always honest with yourself about why you keep people at distance. You require depth from others but have not fully explored the places in your own interior that you find uncomfortable to inhabit. You require consistency from others but have not examined whether your own presentation to the world is as consistent as you believe it to be. The standard you hold for others is always, in some precise and revealing way, a projection of the standard you are still learning to hold for yourself. Marcus Aurelius understood this with a clarity that he applied, characteristically, to himself before he applied it to anyone else. The Meditations are full of moments where he catches himself demanding from others consistency, honesty, equanimity, things that he is simultaneously struggling to maintain in himself. And rather than lowering the standard or abandoning it, he does something far more difficult. He holds the standard and acknowledges the gap between what he requires and what he has so far managed to become. That honesty, the refusal to either abandon the standard or pretend the gap does not exist, is itself a form of friendship with himself. The question your standards for friendship are really asking is not about other people, it is about you. Do you know yourself well enough to know what you actually need from connection? Have you examined your requirements honestly enough to know which ones are self-knowledge and which ones are self-protection? And most importantly, are you willing to be to yourself the kind of friend you are looking for in others? Present, honest, patient with the gap between ideal and reality, and unwilling to perform a version of yourself that is more acceptable than it is true. Because here is what the Stoics arrive at: through different routes but the same destination. The relationship you have with yourself is not separate from the quality of friendships available to you. It is the foundation of it. And the person who has made genuine peace with their own interior, who knows themselves with honesty and accepts themselves with something approaching compassion, will find that their standards for friendship clarify rather than expand. Not because they become less demanding, because they become more accurate. And accurate standards, unlike fearful ones, are occasionally met. Topic set to the Stoic warning about self-sufficiency that nobody quotes. There is a version of Stoic philosophy that has become very popular and is, in one specific and important way, dangerously incomplete. It goes like this: the wise person needs nothing from outside themselves. The wise person is self-contained, self-governing, and self-sufficient. The opinions of others are externals, and externals are not within our control. And therefore the wise person does not need them, does not need approval, does not need company, does not need to be understood or seen or known by anyone other than themselves. This version of Stoicism is clean, powerful, and deeply attractive to anyone who has been hurt by depending on other people. It is also, Seneca made clear in a letter that almost no one quotes, incomplete in a way that matters enormously. The letter is addressed to Lucilius, as most of Seneca's best and most honest writing is, Seneca says something that cuts directly against the popular version of Stoic self-sufficiency. He says that the person who retreats entirely from human company who uses philosophy as a justification for complete withdrawal does not become wiser in the withdrawal. They become, in a specific and measurable way, smaller. Their virtue, untested by the friction of actual human relationship, begins to calcify into habit rather than remaining a levish choice. Their self-sufficiency, which began as genuine independence, gradually hardens into something that looks like strength from the outside and functions like isolation from the inside. Seneca was not being sentimental. He was not arguing that you need men friends or that you should seek approval or that the opinions of others should carry weight in your decisions. He was making a more precise and more uncomfortable point. He was saying that the philosophy of self-sufficiency, taken to its logical extreme without the counterweight of genuine human connection, produces not a sage but a kind of philosophical hermit, a person who has become so accustomed to their own company, so practiced in the art of needing nothing from others, that they have gradually lost the capacity for the very thing that makes self-sufficiency valuable in the first place. Self-sufficiency is valuable because it allows you to choose connection freely rather than compulsively. Because when you do not need people in the desperate, unexamined way that most people need people, the connections you do choose have a quality that compulsive connection never achieves. You are there because you want to be, because the connection adds something real, because the other person meets a standard that you can now hold with clarity, because you are not afraid of what happens if they do not. That is the promise of Stoic self-sufficiency. That is what it is for. But the person who uses self-sufficiency not as a foundation for chosen connection, but as a replacement for it, you has decided, consciously or unconsciously, that the risk of genuine connection is not worth the reward, has taken them to see past the point where it heals and enter the territory where it numbs. And Seneca, with the directness that made him both admired and uncomfortable, said so plainly, Marcus Aurelius knew this tension from the inside. The Meditations are not the writings of a self-sufficient man who has transcended the need for human connection. They are the writings of a man who is actively, visibly, honestly working to maintain his interior stability while remaining genuinely open to the people around him. There's grief in those pages. There is longing. There is the specific act of a person who holds himself to an extraordinarily high standard and finds that standard only in ways he neither denies nor dramatizes. He does not pretend that self-sufficiency is painless. He simply argues that the pain is worth what it protects. The warning that nobody quotes, then, is this: self-sufficiency is a means, not an end. It is the condition that makes genuine connection possible, not the condition that makes genuine connection unnecessary. In the person who has arrived at the place where they genuinely need one who has used philosophy or discipline or the accumulated evidence of past disappointments to construct a life in which human connection has become optional in every sense, has not achieved the Stoic ideal. They have found a sophisticated way to be afraid. The question is not whether you are self-sufficient. The question is what you are doing with your self-sufficiency. Are you using it to choose connection more freely? Or are you using it to avoid connection more comfortably? Because those two answers lead to entirely different lives, and only one of them is what Seneca meant. Topic 8: how the people around you have been quietly shaping who you allow yourself to be. There is a process happening in your life right now that you did not authorize and cannot entirely stop. It operates below the level of conscious decision. It requires no dramatic event, no obvious influence, no single conversation that you could point to afterward and say that was the moment something shifted. It happens in the accumulation of ordinary time spent in ordinary proximity to ordinary people. And by the time most people notice it, it has already been happening for years. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. This is one of the most quoted lines he ever produced, and it is almost always interpreted as being about the internal life, about what you choose to focus on, what you allow to occupy your mind, what kind of thinking you practice and therefore strengthen. That interpretation is correct, but it is incomplete, because the thoughts that dye the soul do not rise in a vacuum. They rise in a context. They rise in the specific, textured, daily reality of the people you spend the most time near. and that context shapes the thoughts before you ever consciously choose them. Epictetus understood this at a level that was not academic. When he wrote about the danger of spending time with people who do not share your values, he was not describing a theoretical risk. He was describing something he had observed with the precision of a man who had spent years in an environment he did not choose, watching what happened to people who absorbed the values of that environment without resistance. He watched people who had arrived with integrity gradually become indistinguishable from the people around them, not through any single act of compromise, but through the slow, almost imperceptible process of finding it easier each day to think the thoughts that the surrounding culture made available, and harder each day to think the ones that required active, effortful maintenance. The mechanism he identified is not weakness, it is efficiency. The human mind is extraordinarily good at adapting to its social environments because for most of human history, social belonging was a survival requirement. The mind that could read the room, absorb the values of the group, and behave in ways that maintained social acceptance was a mind attached to a body that survived. The mind that insisted on its own distinct interior at the cost of social friction was a mind attached to a body that was sometimes expelled, and expulsion, for most of human history, was a death sentence. We do not live in that environment anymore, but we carry the mechanism, and the mechanism does not ask whether the social environment it is adapting to is worth adapting to. It simply adapts, which means that the people you spend the most time with are not merely the people you enjoy, or the people who are available, or the people who happen to arrive in your life through circumstance. They are the architects of your habitual thought, the designers of what feels normal to you, the invisible editors of what you allow yourself to want, to see, to be, and to become. This is why Seneca's advice about choosing company was not social snobbery. It was not about associating only with people of a certain class or education or achievement. It was about something more fundamental. He said, in the letters, that you should be careful about who you allow into your interior, not your home, not your social circle, but your interior, the place where your habitual thoughts form, the place where your sense of what is possible and what is acceptable and what is worth wanting is continuously, quietly, invisibly being calibrated against the people who most consistently occupy your attention. The person who has few close friends is sometimes a person who has understood this consciously or intuitively and has made a decision, not always easy and not always without cost, to protect their interior from the kind of ambient influence that operates too slowly to feel dangerous, and too consistently to leave without a mark. They have chosen the discomfort of a smaller social world over the quiet erosion of a larger one. And the choice, whatever it costs in the short term, is one that Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca would each have recognized and each have respected. The question is not whether you are being shaped by the people around you. You are. Everyone is. The only question is whether the shaping is happening with your awareness and your consent. Whether the people who are dying the color of your habitual thoughts are people whose color you would have chosen if you had been given the choice clearly and consciously rather than gradually and invisibly. If the answer is yes, you are fortunate. If the answer is no, or if the answer is that you are not sure because you have not looked at it clearly until now, then the most honest thing you can do is not to feel guilty about what has already happened. It is to look directly at the room you are in, at the people in it, and ask with the same precision that Epictetus developed in circumstances far more constrained than yours, what color are they? And is that the color I want to become? Topic 9. The ancient test for knowing if someone deserves the most valuable thing you own. You have something that no amount of money can replace, no amount of time can recover once it is spent, and no external force can protect without your active and conscious cooperation. It is not your reputation. It is not your health, though that matters enormously. It is not your team, though team is part of it. It is something older than any of those things and more fundamental than all of them combined. It is your attention. Aline, clicking, have present kind that the modern world is commodified in diametric. Attention in the original and serious sense. The deep, directional, fully inhabited focus that you bring to the things and people that receive the best of what you are. The kind of attention that, when you give it, you are genuinely giving something of yourself. The kind that, when it is misdirected or misused or spent on people and things that do not deserve it, leaves you in a deficit that no amount of rest or distraction can fully repair. Marcus Aurelius called this the hegemony on the ruling faculty, the seat of reason and will and perception from which all of your choices, all of your responses, all of your quality of experience ultimately originate. He spent more words in the meditations on the protection of this faculty than on almost any other subject. Not because he was selfish with it, because he understood that a person who does not protect what is most essential in themselves cannot offer anything real to anyone else. The emperor who depletes his willing faculty in service of demands that do not warrant it is not a more generous emperor. He is a less capable one. The test that emerges from this understanding is not complicated. It is, however, demanding, and it is demanding in exactly the way that makes it useful, because a test that asks nothing of you tells you nothing about anyone. The test is a single question, applied with honesty to every person you are considering allowing into the proximity of your deep attention. The question is not, do I enjoy this person? Enjoyment is real and valuable, but it is not the standard. The question is not, do I love this person? Love is real and valuable, but it can exist at a distance that does not require the sacrifice of your ruling faculty. The question is not even, does this person treat me well? Treatment is the baseline, not the standard. The question is this: does this person, consistently and over time, make me more honest? Not more comfortable, not more entertained, not more validated or more seen in the way that feels good in the moment. More honest. Does being near this person, having access to their perspective, engaging with their mind and their character, does that contact produce in you a clearer, more accurate, more courageous version of your own self-understanding, or does it produce the opposite, the comfortable, slightly softened, carefully managed version of yourself that social acceptability tends to require? Marcus Aurelius applied the standard to the three people he actually trusted, and every one of them passed it. Antoninus made him more honest by being completely consistent, a living demonstration that the gap between private and public self did not have to exist. Rusticus made him more honest by refusing to let him substitute eloquence for truth. Lucius made him more honest by refusing to pretend, which forced Marcus to engage with reality as it was rather than as he might have preferred it to be. All three of them were people in whose presence Marcus Aurelius was more himself. Not a better performing version of himself, not a more philosophically polished version, simply more accurate, more awake, more genuinely present in his own experience. And the quality, the capacity to make you more rather than less of who you actually are is, the Stoics were unanimously clear, the rarest and most valuable thing another human being can offer you. Epictetus applied that same standard from the opposite direction. He said that you should choose your company the way a traveler chooses their road, not by how pleasant the road is to walk on, but by where it leads. A pleasant road that leads away from where you need to go is worse than a difficult road that leads directly there. The test of a companion is not whether the journey is enjoyable, it is whether the destination is where you actually want to arrive. The destination, in the Stoic understanding, is always the same: a more honest, more integrated, more genuinely alive version of yourself. And the people who help you get there who consistently, reliably, sentimentally make you more honest rather than more comfortable deserve the most valuable thing you own. Everyone else deserves your kindness, your goodwill, and your respect, but not your ruling faculty, not your deep attention, not the part of you that, once spent on the wrong things, takes the longest to recover. The test is one question. It requires only honesty to apply, and the answers it produces about the people currently in your life and the people you are still waiting to find out among the most accurate and the most necessary things you will ever learn about both. Topic: There's why the person who has never felt truly known is often the most knowable person in the room. There is a paradox at the center of this kind of life that almost nobody names directly, and the failure to name it is responsible for the specific and persistent form of suffering that has no obvious remedy because it has no obvious diagnosis. The paradox is this: the people who are the most capable of genuine, deep, honest connection are frequently the people who experience the least of it, not because they are incapable of being known, because they are almost impossible to know in the ordinary social environments where knowing is supposed to happen. They are too particular for small talk to reach them, too interior for surface conversation to locate them, too honest for the careful, managed, mutually flattering exchange that passes for intimacy in most social settings to feel like anything other than a performance they are watching from the outside. And so they move through social environments that are genuinely inadequate to their interior. They show up. They participate. They are, by every external measure, present. But the part of them that is most real, most alive, most worth knowing, remains untouched, not because they are hiding it deliberately, because the ordinary social environment was no instrument precise enough to find it. Marcus Aurelius lived this paradox at a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. He was, by virtue of his position, the most publicly known person in the Roman world. His face was on coins. His name was spoken in 60 million households. His decisions shaped the daily reality of an entire civilization. And yet, in the private pages that were never meant to be read, he describes himself with the aching precision of a man who has spent decades in extraordinary proximity to other human beings and who has almost never been genuinely seen by any of them. Not because the people around him were unworthy, not because he was emotionally unavailable, but because what he was the actual interior reality of Marcus Aurelius, the man behind the emperor, the person behind the philosopher, was simply too specific, too complex, and too honest for the social environment of imperial Rome to accommodate. The court could know the emperor, it could not know the men who sat alone at night and wrote sentences that no emperor was supposed to need to write. Epictetus described a version of this from the opposite end of the social spectrum. The slave who has developed a rich and disciplined interior life is, in a profound sense, more knowable than most of the free people around him, because what he is has been clarified by necessity, stripped of the social performance that wealth and status tend to accumulate, reduced to something essential and genuine, and yet that very genuineness makes him harder to reach through ordinary social means. The people around him are equipped for the performance. They have no instruments for the essential. This is not a complaint, it is a structural observation. The very qualities that make a person most genuinely worth knowing are frequently the qualities that make them hardest to access through conventional social interaction. Depth is not efficiently transmitted through small talk. Honesty is not comfortably received in environments built on mutual management of impressions. The particular, the interior, and the genuinely complex do not fit neatly into the social formats that most people use to determine whether someone is worth knowing further. What this means for the person living this paradox is something that takes time to fully absorb, and something that Marcus Aurelius had to return to repeatedly in the meditations before it settled into something he could actually hold without distress. It means that the experience of not being known is not evidence that you are unknowable. It is evidence that you are specific, that the instrument capable of reaching you is a particular kind of attention patient, honest, willing to go past the surface, and developed enough in its own interior to recognize you when it finally arrives at it. Seneca wrote that genuine friendship requires that you believe the person you are opening yourself to is capable of receiving what you are about to give, not capable of agreeing with it or approving of it or reflecting it back in a flattering way, capable of receiving it, of holding it with the care and the honesty that it requires, of not flinching at the parts that are difficult, of not reducing the complex to the simple because the simple is more comfortable to respond to. The person who has moved through life feeling largely unseen is often a person who has been waiting consciously and not for someone capable of receiving them, not performing for them, not entertaining them, not even necessarily understanding them in the full and comprehensive sense that the word implies, simply capable of receiving what is actually there rather than what is easier to respond to. The person exists. They are rare. They are, by definition, hard to find, because the same qualities that make them capable of receiving you are the same qualities that make the ordinary social environment inadequate for them as well. You are both, in some sense, looking for the same thing, waiting for the same instrument, and the recognition, when it finally happens, when two people whose interiors are developed enough to actually reach each other finally do, is not gradual. It does not accumulate through pleasant exchanges and shared experiences and the slow building of trust. It arrives like a fact, sudden, specific, and carrying the particular quality of something that was always true and was simply, finally, been said out loud. You were always knowable. The room was simply full of the wrong instruments. Topic on the hidden cost of performing friendship you don't actually feel. There is a tax that almost nobody talks about because almost everybody pays it and most people have paid it for so long that they have stopped noticing it as a separate expense. It is collected not in money or team, though both are involved. It is collected in something more fundamental and more difficult to replenish. It is collected in the specific energy that it costs to be someone you are not in front of people who have no idea that is what is happening. Performance is the worry, and it is the right word, but it needs to be clarified before it can be useful. The performance being described here is not necessarily dramatic or deliberate. It is not the performance of the obviously fake person who says things they do not mean in a voice that does not belong to them. It is something quieter and more pervasive than that. It is the performance of the person who shows up to a dinner they did not want to attend and converses with genuine presentness about things that genuinely do not interest them, who laughs at the right moments and asks the right questions and leaves 2 hours later feeling, for no reason they could easily explain, as though something has been taken from them. That taking is real, and it is worth understanding precisely. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this experience in the Meditations with the directness of a man who had no one to perform for in his private pages and therefore had no reason to soften the observation. He described the depletion that followed hours of court life, not the difficult hours, not the hours of genuine crisis and demanding decision, but the ordinary hours of maintained social presence, as being appropriately imperial in all the ways that being appropriately imperial required. He described returning to his writing in the hours before dawn not merely to think but to recover, to locate himself again after a day of being someone that the role required him to be. What he was describing is the specific exhaustion of performed presence, and it is different from the exhaustion of genuine engagement in a way that anyone who has experienced both will immediately recognize. Genuine engagement depletes you and replenishes you simultaneously, in the way that any real expenditure of self tends to do. You give something and something returns. The transaction is real in both directions. Performed presence only depletes. There is no return because there is no genuine exchange. You are spending energy maintaining a version of yourself that does not actually exist in the same way that a machine spends energy maintaining a temperature continuously, invisibly, and entirely without product. Epictetus identified what he called the cost of misused impressions, the specific toll exacted by responding to the world, as it demands you respond rather than as your own honest assessment would have you respond. He was not talking about performance in the theatrical sense. He was talking about the constant, grinding labor of aligning your external presentation with an audience's expectations rather than with your own interior reality. And he said, plainly, that this labor is among the most exhausting that a human being can undertake, precisely because it is never finished. The performance is no final act, it simply continues until you are alone, and then it stops, and the silence that follows is not peace but relief. The particular cost of performing friendship you do not genuinely feel goes beyond the energy of the performance itself. It costs you something in your relationship with your own perception. Because every time you perform connection, every time you act as though a relationship is more nourishing than it is, as though a person is more interesting to you than they added, as though the time you are spending is adding something that it is actually subtracting you, are practicing a small but consistent deception of yourself. You are training your own interior to second-guess its honest assessments. You are making it harder, each time, to trust what you actually feel in someone else's company, because you have so frequently overridden that feeling in the service of social acceptability. Seneca called this the corruption of the inner witness. The inner witness is the faculty that knows, beneath all performance and all social pressure and all the complicated motivations that social life produces, what is actually true about your experience. It knows whether you are genuinely glad to be somewhere or performing gladness because the alternative is more complicated. It knows whether you genuinely care about a person or are maintaining a relationship because the cost of ending it is higher than the cost of continuing it. And every time you perform against its honest testimony, you are teaching it that its testimony does not matter. You are, gradually and with entirely good intentions, corrupting the most reliable instrument you have. The people who have few close friendships and have chosen that situation consciously rather than simply failing to achieve more have often done so partly because they have recognized this cost. They have understood, through accumulated experience, that performing friendship they do not feel is not a small thing to ask of themselves. It is not the price of social participation that everyone pays equally and no one can avoid. It is a specific and serious cost to specific and serious things. To their energy, to their self-knowledge, to the reliability of their own inner witness, and they have decided at some point that those things are worth protecting even at the social cost of protecting them. Marcus Aurelius did not perform his friendships. He maintained the social obligations of his role with extraordinary discipline and genuine care. But the people he chose for the interior room, the three who actually received his deep attention, were people in whose company no performance was required. And the meditations, written in the margins of all that public performance, are the record of what it felt like to finally, in the privacy of his own pages, take the performance off. What they reveal is a man who was, beneath all of it, genuinely himself. Specific, honest, occasionally despairing, often grateful, always searching. A man who paid the tax of public performance with discipline and without complaint, and who spent the private hours recovering what the performance had cost him. The question is not whether you perform. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether the performing is worth what it costs. Whether the relationships that require it are giving you something real enough to justify the depletion they produce. Whether the social world you are maintaining through the performance is a world you actually want, or simply a world that is easier to maintain than to honestly examine it. Because the moment you examine it honestly, the moment you look at each relationship in your life and ask, simply and without the pressure of what the answer should be, whether this connection nourishes or depletes the answer, will tell you something that no social calendar and no list of contacts and no measure of how full your life looks from the outside will ever be able to tell you. It will tell you what your life actually costs, and what it is actually giving you in return. Topic does what happens to a person who spends years without being truly witnessed. There is a specific kind of damage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a crisis or a breakdown or a moment that you can point to afterward and say that was when something changed. It accumulates the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water, slowly, continuously, invisibly, until one day the water is no longer clear and you cannot keep to remember when it stopped being so. The damage being described here is what happens to a person who moves through years of their life without being genuinely witnessed by another human being, without having a single person in their life who knows who they actually are and not the version they present to the world, not the version that the role requires, not the version that social acceptability has gradually shaped through 1,000 small accommodations, but the actual interior person, with all of their specificity and all of their difficulty and all of the things that are most genuinely themselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations because he had no one to say these things to. This is the sentence that, once you understand it clearly, changes the way you read every page of the document. These are not philosophical exercises. They are not the organized thoughts of a man who had processed his interior life sufficiently in conversation and was now committing the conclusions to paper. They are the raw and ongoing testimony of a man who was witnessing himself because no one else was able to. Writing to himself because there was no one else to write to about the things that mattered most. He was not complaining about this. He was not asking to be pitied. He was doing what any person of genuine interior life does when the ordinary social environment cannot accommodate what they carry. He created an alternative space for it. A private one. A written one. A space where his actual thoughts could exist without being managed or performed or softened for an audience that could not have received them. But here is what the Meditations also reveal between the lines of the philosopher and the practical instruction and the self-directed exhortation. Here is what shows up in the texture of the writing itself rather than in what it explicitly says. The absence of witnessing leaves a mark, even in a person of extraordinary discipline and extraordinary self-knowledge. The sustained absence of being genuinely known by another human being produces something that Marcus Aurelius could not entirely discipline away. A kind of recurring desolation, a quality of Aurelius that is not the chosen, generative solitude of the philosopher but something more specific and more personal. The Aurelians of a person whose interior is full and whose surroundings are full, and the distance between those two fullnesses is, in the private hours, genuinely painful. Epictetus addressed what happens over time to the person who is not witnessed. He said that the unexamined life, meaning the life that is not subjected to honest reflection, gradually loses its coherence. The person who never has to articulate who they are, never has to bring their interior into contact with another interior in the specific and demanding way that genuine friendship requires, gradually loses the thread of their own narrative. Not because they stop thinking, but because thinking alone and thinking in genuine dialogue with another mind are not the same process and do not produce the same clarity. Genuine witnessing, the kind that real friendship provides at its best, is not simply the experience of being seen. It is the experience of being seen and having what is seen reflected back with honesty and care. It is, in a very real sense, the experience of having your own interior confirmed as real, of having another person look at what you actually are and not what you perform, not what you present, but what you actually are in your most honest and least managed moments, and say, implicitly or explicitly, yes, that is real, I see it, it exists. Without that confirmation, something happens that Seneca described with the precision of a man who had also experienced its early stages before his own close friendships gave him the ground to stand on. The interior life begins, very gradually, to feel provisional, uncertain of its own reality, like a room that no one else has ever entered, which begins after enough time to feel not like a private sanctuary but like something whose existence is never kept and verified. The person in that room knows they are there, but knowing and being witnessed are not the same thing. In the absence of witnessing, overuse produces not a piece of genuine solitude but the particular unease of a person who was beginning to wonder, in the quietest and most private corner of themselves, whether anyone would ever find the room worth entering. This is not a descent into fragility. It is not a crisis of confidence in the ordinary sense. It is something more structural and more subtle than that. It is the slow erosion of the certainty that your interior is worth being presented. That the specific and difficult and honest person you are in your most private moment is a person that another human being could encounter and choose to remain near. The people who come through years of not being genuinely witnessed and arrive on the other side still intact, still specific, still honest, still capable of genuine connection when it finally becomes available have almost always done what Marcus Aurelius did. They have found a way to witness themselves, not as a replacement for being witnessed by others, as a preservation of the interior until the witnessing becomes possible. The journal, the long walk, the private discipline of honest self-examination that Stoicism is built on, these are not merely philosophical practices. They are, for the person who has spent years without genuine witnessing, a form of keeping the room inhabited, of continuing to furnish it, to tend to it, to maintain its existence against the quiet pressure of a world that does not seem to know it is there. Because the room is there, it has always been there. And the person capable of entering it, the specific, patient, honest person whose own interior is developed enough to recognize years when they finally find that the person is not a fantasy. They are simply rare, and the years spent without them are not wasted years. They are the years in which you learned, through the specific education of sustained solitude, exactly what the room contains, so that when someone finally enters it, you can tell them where everything is, and they will already know. Topic 3 is the specific kind of courage it takes to keep your standards when everyone else is settled. There is a pressure that builds so gradually and derives from so many directions simultaneously that most people do not experience it as pressure at all. They experience it as reality, as the natural and inevitable shape of adult life. is what happens when you grow up and understand that the world does not arrange itself according to what you need and that the appropriate response to that fact is adjustment. Reasonable, mature, socially endorsed adjustment. The adjustment being described as the one that happens to standards for friendship, and that happens in stages that are each individually defensible and collectively devastating. The first stage arrives in the mid-20s, when the social architecture that provided automatic proximity to potential friends, school, university, shared housing begins to dissolve. The people you were close to scatter. New closeness requires active cultivation rather than passive proximity, and active cultivation is harder than it looked when proximity was doing most of the work. So you make do with what is available. You invest in the friendships that are easiest to maintain rather than the ones that are most nourishing. Not because you have decided to lower your standards, because the gap between what you need and what is immediately available is temporarily too large to cross without more effort than the moment seems to warrant. The second stage arrives when the people around you begin to settle into marriages, into the specific and consuming world of young parenthood, into careers that absorb the hours that friendship used to occupy. You watch the people you knew reconstruct their social lives around proximity and convenience and shared circumstance. You watch them call those reconstructed lives deeply satisfying, and you wonder, with a discomfort you do not entirely know what to do with, whether what you are still waiting for is real, whether you have simply failed to make the adjustment that everyone else seems to have made. Without apparent difficulty, the third stage is the most dangerous. It is the stage where the waiting begins to look, from both the inside and the outside, like arrogance, where the refusal to settle begins to feel, in the absence of any alternative, like a choice that is costing you something you will not be able to recover, where the standards that once felt like integrity begin to feel like isolation, and the isolation begins to feel like evidence that the standards were wrong, and the temptation to lower them to accept what is available rather than continue waiting for what is needed becomes genuinely difficult to resist. Marcus Aurelius knew this pressure from the inside. The Meditations contain multiple passages where he argues with himself not gently and not briefly about the cost of maintaining standards in a world that does not share them. He understood, from long personal experience, that the person who refuses to lower their standards for what deserves their deep attention will be misunderstood, will appear to people who have settled as either arrogant or damaged, will carry the social cost of a position that most people around them have decided is not worth holding. And he held it anyway, not without difficulty, not without the specific ash of watching the world around him make accommodations that he would not make, but with the Stoic understanding that a standard abandoned under social pressure was not a standard that had been honestly examined and found wanting. It was a standard that had been surrendered to the wrong authority. Epictetus, who understood authority and its abuse with a clarity that no free person could keep to replicate, was precise about what it means to surrender your standards to social pressure. He said it is one thing to change your position because honest examination has revealed that it was wrong. It is another thing entirely to change your position because the people around you are uncomfortable with it. The first is wisdom. The second is compliance disguised as maturity. And the disguise, he said, is so good that most people who are complying genuinely believe they are growing. The courage required to maintain your standards when everyone else is settled is not the dramatic courage of the battlefield or the public stand. It is quieter than that and, in its own way, more demanding. It is the courage of continuing to believe, in the absence of evidence and in the presence of significant social pressure to stop believing, that what you are waiting for is real. That the connection you have not yet found is not a fantasy produced by unrealistic expectations but a genuine possibility that has not yet arrived. That the right response to its absence is not adjustment but patience. Seneca addressed this form of courage in his letters with the directness that characterized his most honest writing. He said that the person who lowers their standard for friendship in response to its scarcity has confused the solution with the problem. The problem is not that your standard is too high. The problem is that genuine connection is genuinely rare, and the solution to the rarity of a genuine thing is not to start accepting imitations. It is to become the kind of person who, when the genuine thing finally arrives, is still capable of recognizing it. That recognition requires that you have kept the standard intact, that you have not spent years practicing a lower version of connection until the higher version feels unfamiliar and excessive, that you have maintained, through however much social pressure and however much loneliness and however many stages of adjustment that the world is endorsed, and that you have refused a clear and honest sense of what you are actually looking for and why. The people who have done this, who have arrived at middle life or latif, still holding the standard, still waiting for the connection that meets it, still refusing to call something by a name it does not deserve, are not people who have failed at friendship. They are people who have understood something about friendship, but the settling majority has decided is too expensive to understand. They have understood that connection at the level they needed is not a luxury that can be replaced by connection at a lower level without cost. That the cost of settling is not merely the absence of what you needed, it is the gradual forgetting of what you were looking for, and that forgetting, once complete, is the only form of loss in this territory that is genuinely irreversible. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, in one of the meditations, a reminder that is the quality of a man speaking to himself across time, leaving a message for the future version of himself who might be tempted, in a moment of exhaustion or loneliness or social pressure, to let the standard go. He wrote that the objective of life is not to be on the side of the majority but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. He meant it as he meant most things, precisely. The insanity he was describing is not dramatic. It is the quiet, socially endorsed, universally practiced insanity of accepting less than you know to be real, because accepting it is easier than continuing to hold out for what you know to be true. You know what is true. You have known it for a long time. The question is only whether you are still willing to hold it. And the answer to the question, whatever it is, will determine not just the quality of your future friendships, but the quality of your relationship with your own integrity for every year you have remaining. Topic 14. What happens when two people whose interiors are large enough finally find each other? Everything that has been said in this video until now has been about absence, about the experience of moving through a world that does not keep to have the instruments to reach you, about the cost of that experience and the courage it requires and the specific damage it does over time and the specific integrity it demands if you are going to come through it without losing the thing that made the experience necessary in the first place. This topic is about something different. It is about what happens when the absence ends. Not through settling, not through lowering the standard until something meets it, not through the gradual, socially endorsed redefinition of what connection means until the word has been stretched far enough to cover what is available, through the actual arrival of the thing itself, the specific, unmistakable, slightly disorienting experience of encountering another human being whose interior is large enough to meet yours, whose depth is sufficient to receive what you have been carrying without flinching, whose honesty is precise enough to reflect you back to yourself accurately rather than flatteringly. Marcus Aurelius described the quality of his connection with Rusticus, the teacher who demanded truth over eloquence with a restraint that, when you understand what he was restraining, is more moving than any effusive description could be. He did not describe warmth. He did not describe ease or comfort, but the pleasant experience of being in someone else's company. He described what Rusticus required of him, what Rusticus made possible in him, the specific changes that contact with that particular mind produced in his own. He described the connection entirely in terms of what it did to his interior rather than what it felt like in his presence. And the description, that characteristically Stoic refusal to sentimentalize, is itself a portrait of what genuine connection between two developed interiors actually produces. It does not primarily produce feeling. It primarily produces clarity. This is the thing that surprises people who have spent years waiting for genuine connection and imagining, in that waiting, that its arrival will feel a certain way, that it will feel like relief, or like recognition, or like the specific emotional warmth that the culture uses as the primary indicator of meaningful relationship. And those things are present, but they are not the primary experience. The primary experience is clarity, a sudden, specific, not entirely comfortable sharpness of self-perception that arrives because another mind perceives and honest and developed enough to actually see you as now in genuine contact with yours. Epictetus described the effect of genuine company on the interior with an observation that cuts against every romantic notion of what connection is supposed to feel like. He said that the person in whose presence you become more honest is not necessarily the person in whose presence you feel most comfortable. Honesty is not always comfortable. Being seen accurately is not always pleasant. The experience of having another person understand you precisely, not approximately, not in the flattering version, but precisely carries with it the vulnerability that is real and the discomfort that is real and the quality of exposure that is not immediately distinguishable from risk. What makes it different from risk is what comes after the exposure. With the wrong person, exposure produces regret. The thing you revealed is used against you, or mishandled, or reflected back in a distorted way that makes you wish you had kept it to yourself. With the right person, the person whose interior is large enough to actually hold what you have given them, exposure produces something that was no better named than relief. Not the relief of having been rescued. The relief of having been received. Of having put something down that you have been carrying alone for a long time and discovered that another pair of hands was steady enough to hold it. Seneca wrote about this experience in a letter that is among the most personal things he ever committed to paper. He described the specific quality of time spent in the company of a genuine friend by which he met a person who met his standard, which was the standard of someone who had thought carefully about what friendship actually required. He said that an hour in the company restored something that months of ordinary social life had been unable to produce. Not because the hour contained more conversation or more shared experience or more of any of the things that social life is usually made of. Because the quality of the contact was of a different order entirely. He was, in that hour, genuinely present, not performing presence, not maintaining the managed, appropriate, socially functional version of presence that ordinary social interaction requires. Genuinely, completely, without remainder, present. The quality of presence, the specific experience of being with someone in whose company no performance is required and no management is necessary and no version of yourself other than the actual version is demanded, is the thing that the waiting was for. It is not a feeling that can be manufactured through effort or sustained through discipline or produced by choosing to be more open or more available or more willing to meet people where they are. It is the natural and inevitable result of two interiors that are developed enough to actually reach each other, finally being in the same place at the same time and recognizing, with the specific and unsentimentalized clarity of genuine Stoic perception, what they have found. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in a passage that is rarely cited because it does not fit the popular image of the self-sufficient Stoic philosopher, that the good of rational beings lies in community. Not in the self-sufficiency that transcends community, not in the wisdom that no longer requires it. In community itself, in the specific, irreplaceable, philosophically serious thing that happens when two rational beings encounter each other honestly and allow the encounter to actually occur rather than managing it into something safer and shallower and more socially acceptable. What happens when two people whose interiors are large enough finally find each other is not a story. It is not a dramatic event with a clear before and after. It is more like a calibration, a quiet, ongoing adjustment of your sense of what is possible, of what conversation can actually do, of what it feels like to be understood at the level where you actually live rather than the level where most interaction takes place. And it changes something that the years of waiting without it had begun, very slowly, to erode. Not your standards, not your integrity, not the specific and demanding and entirely honest sense of what you were looking for that you maintained through every stage of social pressure and every well-meaning suggestion that you were being unrealistic. What it changes is the certainty that the waiting was the right choice. Because when it finally arrives, when the interior that has been inhabited alone forcefully, genuinely, ended by another person, was the capacity to be that the only thing that becomes clear is that nothing else would have been worth settling for. Not because what you have now is perfect, because what you have now is real, and real, after everything, is the only thing that was ever worth waiting for. Topic is the one question that changes everything you thought you knew about your social life. Finally, we arrive at the place this entire conversation was been moving toward, not a summary, not a list of things to remember or implement or share with someone who needs to hear them, A single question, the one that Marcus Aurelius circled around in the Meditations without ever keep landing on directly. The one that Epictetus implied in everything he wrote about company and interior life and the cost of misused attention. The one that Seneca came closest to asking explicitly in a letter that most people read for the philosophy and miss for the honesty. The question is not how many friends do you have. You already know that number is not the point. The question is not whether your standards are too high, whether you have been too selective, or whether the person you are waiting for actually exists. This entire video has answered those questions, and the answers are: your standards are the most honest thing about you, the selectivity is not the problem, and the person exists. The question is this: who, in your life right now, actually knows who you are? Not who knows your history. Not who knows your preferences and your habits and the stories you tell about yourself at dinner parties. Not who knows the version of you that exists in the social world, the one that is pleasant and capable and appropriately open and reliably present. Not who knows the you that has been shaped by years of social performance and careful self-management and the accumulated adjustments that living among other people requires. Who knows the interior, who has been inside the room, who has seen the specific, honest, and managed, performed person that you are in the private hours and chosen to remain, who has received what you actually are rather than what you present, and held it with enough care and enough honesty that you knew, in the receiving, that you had finally been witnessed. If you can name a person, even one person, the answer to the question is the most valuable piece of information about your social life that you possess, because that person, whoever they are, is the standard. They are the living proof that the connection you need is not a fantasy. They are the evidence that your interior is receivable and that your standard is not impossibly high but simply specifically high. And the quality of your relationship with that person, the specific way they make you more honest, more present, more genuinely yourself, is the template against which every future connection in your life is worth measuring. If you cannot name a person, the answer to the question is not a verdict. It is a direction. It is pointing you, with the precision that only a genuinely honest question can produce, toward the one thing that all of us, all of the philosophy and the self-knowledge and the maintained standards and the refused adjustments has been in service of. It is pointing you toward the recognition that the waiting is not over, that the interior is still intact, that the room is still furnished and still inhabited and still waiting to be entered by someone whose own interior is developed enough to find it worth entering. Marcus Aurelius answered this question honestly in the Meditations. The answer, written between the lines of the philosophy rather than stated directly, is that in all the decades of his public life, across all the extraordinary proximity to extraordinary minds that his position afforded, he could name very few. He kept looking. He kept the standard. He kept writing to himself in the absence of anyone else to write to. And in the keeping and that sustained, sentimentalized, philosophically rigorous refusal to call something by a name it did not deserve, he preserved the integrity of his interior against the considerable pressure of a world that would have been entirely satisfied with a lesser version of it. Epictetus answered it from the other direction. He could not choose his company. He could not select who entered his physical space or his daily life, but he answered the question about who actually knew him by becoming, with extraordinary discipline and extraordinary honesty, someone worth knowing, someone whose interior was so developed, so precisely understood by its inhabitant, so clearly articulated in the philosophy he eventually dictated to the students who wrote it down that 2,000 years later, in rooms he never entered, in languages he never spoke, in circumstances he could not have. Imagine it, people are still finding their way to it and recognizing, with the specific shock of genuine encounter, that something in it knows them. Seneca answered it by writing the letters, by creating, in the ongoing correspondence with Lucilius, a space in which the question was answered continuously and honestly and without the management that public life required. In those letters, someone knew him, and the letters have survived because the knowing in them the specific quality of one interior in genuine contact with another is recognizable across time in the way that only genuinely real things are. The question changes everything not because the answer is always good. It is sometimes painful. Sometimes the honest answer is that no one currently in your life actually knows who you are. Sometimes the honest answer is that the person who used to know you no longer does, and the distance between what they knew and what you have become is widened into something that would take more honesty than either of you has recently practiced to cross. Sometimes the honest answer is that you have not yet been willing to let anyone close enough to actually know, for reasons that this video has described with more precision than is always comfortable. But the question is still the one worth asking, because it is the only question about your social life that is actually about your social life, about the reality of it rather than the appearance of it, about what it is giving you rather than what it looks like from the outside, about whether you are genuinely known rather than simply well regarded. Stop counting the names. Stop measuring the calendar. Stop comparing the size of your social world to the social worlds of people who have decided that what they have is enough, because the comparison has never told you anything true and it never will. Ask the question instead. Ask it with the honesty that Marcus Aurelius brought to his private pages, with the precision that Epictetus brought to everything he examined, with the courage that Seneca brought to the letters he wrote, knowing that honesty at that level would outlast him. Who actually knows who you are? The answer, whatever it is, however few names it contains, however much it costs to look at it directly, is the most accurate map of your social life that has ever existed. It will tell you what you have. It will tell you what you are still looking for. It will tell you whether the waiting has been for something real, whether the waiting has itself become a way of avoiding the risk of being known. And it will tell you, with the specific and unsparing clarity of a question that has been waiting for you to ask it for a very long time, exactly where to go from here. Not toward more people, not toward a fuller calendar or a longer list or a more socially abundant life by any conventional measure. Toward the one thing that all of it, all of the philosophy, all of the standards, all of the courage and the waiting and the refusal to settle was always pointing toward being known. Genuinely, specifically, honestly, completely known by at least one person in this world who has seen the interior and chosen, with full information and complete honesty, to remain. That is not too much to want. It is the only thing worth wanting. And the fact that you have wanted it all along, that you have held the standard and kept the room inhabited and refused to call something real that was only convenient, that fact is not evidence of difficulty, damage, or unrealistic expectation. It is the most honest thing about you, and it always has been.